Alright, let's go. For most of the planet's history, the largest animals on land had nothing to fear that walked on two legs. Then, over roughly the last 50,000 years, in Australia, in Europe, in the Americas, and on the last islands people ever reached, that stopped being true, and the fossil record shows what happened next with a bluntness that rarely survives this far back. Bone with a tool still lodged inside it. An eggshell scorched on one side only. A species with a stable, healthy population 1 century, and gone the next. 10 of those animals are on this list, working from the most argued over case to the one nobody has ever managed to argue with, because someone was standing there with a notebook when it happened. If you want to uncover the evidence behind history's most unbelievable disappearances, subscribe now. The first case is where the trail begins, and it gets darker from here. Number 10. The bird that burned in the fire pits of Australia. Genyornis newtoni stood taller than a grown man, weighed somewhere around 200 kilograms, and could not fly. It belonged to a family of birds called mihirungs, a word borrowed from Aboriginal language meaning giant bird. And it had walked the plains of Australia for something like 50,000 years before it stopped walking them at all. What ended it did not come from a battlefield or a kill site. It came from an eggshell. In 2016, a team led by the geochronologist Gifford Miller published a study examining more than 2,000 fragments of Genyornis eggshell collected from sites across the continent. Roughly 1 in 5 of the fragments bore a distinctive pattern of scorching, a kind of burn consistent with an egg placed briefly at the edge of a fire and then removed, not a scorch consistent with wildfire, which chars unevenly and randomly. Wildfire burns the shell where it lies. This burn pattern sat consistently on one side, the geometry of something rotated over heat by a hand. Miller's team had seen the same signature before on the shells of emu eggs, cooked at Aboriginal campsites still in use today. The dating placed the practice starting around 54,000 years ago and running for millennia, overlapping precisely with the window in which Genyornis vanishes from the fossil and eggshell record. No other predator on the continent was in a position to raid nests of an animal that size across that broad a range, since Australia's marsupial predators of the period, while formidable, were not egg specialists working across the whole breadth of the mihirung's range, the way a mobile, tool-using forager could be. The retort came quickly. Other researchers, including the paleontologist Trevor Worthy, argued the scorch marks could have other explanations, and questioned whether the eggshell fragments were even Genyornis at all, rather than a different, smaller bird. The debate has not fully settled. What both sides agree on is the timing. Genyornis disappears from Australia within the same broad window that anatomically modern humans first arrive on the continent, a coincidence that keeps recurring throughout this list and rarely reads as coincidence twice. No complete skeleton of Genyornis has ever been found. What survives instead is fragments. Legs and skulls scattered across dry lake beds in South Australia, and now a scatter of scorched shell that may be the closest thing to a smoking gun for humans and megafauna anywhere on the continent. A single Genyornis egg would have weighed close to 1.5 kilograms, roughly 10 times the volume of a chicken egg, which means a nest raided once was a substantial meal, and a nest raided regularly, generation after generation, across a continent where the bird had no prior experience of a two-legged predator with any interest in its eggs at all, was a slow drain the species had never evolved defenses against. Emus, by contrast, survived the same arrival of people, and remain common across Australia today, a difference researchers have pointed to as evidence that it was not predation pressure in general that ended Genyornis, but something closer to a specific vulnerability at the nest. The bird left no genome to sequence, and no living relative close enough to compare. What it left is a burn pattern on a shell, rotated evenly over heat by someone who wanted breakfast, and had no way of knowing there would be nothing left of the species within a few thousand years. Number 9. Diprotodon optatum was the largest marsupial that ever lived, something close to the size of a hippopotamus, herbivorous, slow, built along the same body plan as a wombat, scaled up past anything a wombat should be. It grazed across Australia for well over 1 million years, through ice ages and interglacials, and then it stopped, sometime within the last 50,000 years, in a window that again lines up with the arrival of people. The clearest single site is Cuddy Springs, a dry lakebed in New South Wales excavated through the 1990s and 2000s by a team including Judith Field. The site produced Diprotodon bones and stone tools in the same layers, some bones bearing marks that Field and her colleagues read as cut marks and percussion fractures consistent with butchery. The claim was contested immediately and has stayed contested. Critics, among them the archaeologist Richard Fulligar, working from a different angle, and other specialists in taphonomy, argued the layers could have been mixed by water action or later disturbance, meaning old bones and younger tools could end up sitting together without ever having met the same living animal. Cuddy Springs became, and remains, one of the most argued over sites in Australian archaeology, a single lakebed carrying the weight of an entire continent's extinction debate. Diprotodon's biology made it a particularly poor candidate for weathering any new source of pressure. Growth ring analysis of its teeth, similar in principle to counting rings in a tree, published by researchers examining museum specimens, suggests the animal grew slowly and lived for decades, meaning a population that lost breeding adults faster than it could replace them had very little room to recover before the losses compounded. The wider pattern outside that one contested site is not contested in the same way. Genetic and dating work published in 2017 by a team led by Gilbert Price used amino acid racemization, a dating method that tracks the slow breakdown of proteins in shell and bone, to build a chronology of Diprotodon's last populations across Australia. The extinction dates cluster later in some regions than others, consistent with a wave of loss moving unevenly across the continent rather than one clean climate event, striking everywhere at once. The pattern you would expect from people moving through a landscape rather than a shift in rainfall moving through it. What is not in dispute is what Diprotodon was. It had no natural predator on a continent that had evolved in isolation for tens of millions of years. It had never needed to be fast or wary. Trackway evidence found more recently at Lake Calabana, where entire family groups of Diprotodon appear to have died together stuck in drying mud, shows an animal that traveled in herds and, based on the arrangement of adult and juvenile trackways side by side, likely showed some degree of parental care. A slow reproductive strategy of the kind that leaves a species with almost no ability to recover from sustained losses. A slow, unwary, house-sized animal walking into a landscape recently occupied by people armed with fire and spears is, on the numbers alone, a bad position to be in, whatever the truth turns out to be about Cuddy Springs, specifically. The bones sit now in the Australian Museum in Sydney, along with cabinets of the disputed stone tools, still waiting on the argument that surrounds them to end. Number 8. The woolly rhinoceros, Coelodonta antiquitatis, is one of the few Ice Age giants preserved often enough that its extinction can be studied down almost to the individual. It carried 2 horns, a thick coat, and a hump of fat across its shoulders, built for a cold, dry steppe that stretched from Western Europe to Siberia, and it appears in cave art across that entire range, most famously on the walls of the Chauvet Cave in France, painted around 36,000 years ago, by people who clearly knew the animal's shape well enough to render its double horn from memory. The permafrost of Siberia has given up whole rhinoceros carcasses, skin and hair intact, most famously a nearly complete specimen recovered from the Kolyma River Basin and now held at the Yakutian Academy of Sciences in Yakutsk, a find so well preserved on recovery in 2014 that researchers were able to examine its stomach contents directly and identify the grasses and sedges it had eaten in the days before it died, a level of resolution almost never available for an animal extinct for 10,000 years. These frozen animals let researchers do something almost never possible with Ice Age megafauna: read their diet, their last meals, and in a handful of cases, their cause of death directly from stomach contents and wound patterns, rather than inferring it from bones alone. A large-scale genetic study published in 2021 by a team including Adana Lord and Love Dallin sequenced DNA from 14 woolly rhinoceroses spanning the final 50,000 years of the species' existence, and found the population had stayed large and genetically healthy right up until close to the very end, showing no sign of the long grinding decline you would expect from a species being squeezed slowly by a changing climate over thousands of years. The population was fine, and then it was gone, within a window that lines up with warming at the close of the last ice age and with human hunters pushing further into Siberia. The paper's own conclusion leaned toward climate as the dominant trigger for this particular species, since rhinoceros habitat contracted sharply as the steppe gave way to forest and tundra, an outcome argued to be less about a spear and more about grass disappearing. Other researchers, reading the same broader Siberian record, have pointed to the near-simultaneous disappearance of multiple large grazing species, precisely as humans expand across the same territory, and have asked why climate alone would explain a die-off that lines up this closely with human arrival, across species with very different ecological needs. Butchered woolly rhinoceros remains are rarer in the archaeological record than mammoth remains from the same period, which some researchers take as further support for a climate-driven collapse, and others take simply as a reflection of how few rhinoceroses were left by the time human populations in Siberia grew dense enough to leave a heavy archaeological footprint. A carcass found in 2014 near the Chukochia River with a mostly intact horn and hide showed no sign of human interference at all. An old bull that appears to have died of natural causes and dropped into a bog. A reminder that not every frozen specimen is going to settle an argument about the ones that never froze. The honest answer is that with the woolly rhinoceros, unlike several other animals on this list, the case for a hunted extinction is weaker than the case for one driven mostly by a disappearing habitat. It is included here because the debate itself is instructive. Two well-funded, well-published research groups working from genuinely excellent frozen evidence and still unable to agree on how much of the blame belongs to the spear and how much to the retreating grass. The horn survives in permafrost. The certainty does not. Number 7. The Irish elk, Megaloceros giganteus, was not an elk and was not only Irish. It was a giant deer standing over 2 meters at the shoulder, carrying antlers that could span 3.5 meters tip to tip, the largest antlers of any deer that has ever lived, and it ranged across Ireland, Britain, and continental Europe into western Siberia for hundreds of thousands of years before its last populations died out. Ireland's peat bogs preserved the species unusually well. Ballybatog Bog outside Dublin alone has produced more than 100 skeletons, some with antlers still articulated to the skull, pulled from the peat since the 18th century, and now scattered through collections, including the Natural History Museum in Dublin, where a mounted skeleton has stood on display for generations. Antlers spread wide enough that visitors instinctively step back from it. The animal's size became its own scientific puzzle. Stephen Jay Gould wrote at length about the Irish elk's antlers as a case study in evolutionary constraint, arguing against the older idea that the antlers had simply grown too large for the animal to survive, a kind of evolutionary excess that doomed the species on its own. That reading has mostly fallen out of favor. More recent work, including isotope analysis of Irish elk bone and antler chemistry, published by researchers including Anthony Stewart, has pointed instead toward a habitat argument. The giant deer needed open, mineral-rich grassland to grow antlers of that size every single year, and as forests spread across Europe with warming climate at the end of the last ice age, that grassland contracted sharply in exactly the regions where the last Irish elk populations are found. That still leaves the final populations, which survived in pockets of Siberia for thousands of years after the Irish and British populations were gone. The youngest confirmed remains dated to around 7,700 years ago in the Ural region, well into a period when human hunters were established and active across that same ground. Rock art at sites across that same Siberian range depicts the animal with its full antler spread, drawn by people who had clearly hunted it and knew its silhouette well enough to render the distinctive palmate shape at speed, evidence that the two species overlapped there for a long stretch before the deer's final disappearance, not a brief encounter at the very end. A last population of a slow-breeding, resource-hungry giant deer already squeezed onto a shrinking island of the right habitat, meeting hunters with nowhere left to retreat to, is not a story that needs an exotic explanation. It is the same story that recurs across this list in different climates and different centuries. An animal built for a world that was disappearing, finished off by a species that was not going anywhere. Number 6. The cave bear Ursus spelaeus is named for where it is found rather than where it lived. Since the deep limestone caves of Europe that preserve its bones by the tens of thousands were also, in many cases, its den, its hibernation ground, and its grave. The species was larger than any brown bear alive today, mostly herbivorous, based on isotope studies of its bone collagen, and by some estimates it may have made up the single largest source of large mammal bone found in European Ice Age cave deposits. Entire chambers floored ankle deep in the remains of animals that died there over tens of thousands of winters. The relationship between cave bears and people was not simple predator and prey. Caves suitable for a bear's winter hibernation were also the caves people wanted for shelter, for burial, and eventually for art, and the two species were, by necessity, competing for the same real estate. Chauvet Cave again provides some of the clearest evidence. Cave bear skulls arranged deliberately on rock outcrops within the cave. One skull placed on a stone block near the center of a chamber in a position too specific to be accidental, alongside claw marks on the walls left by bears, and, in at least one heavily discussed case, a bear skull that appears to have been positioned by human hands rather than left where the animal died. A genetic study published in 2023 by a team including Alexander Immel and Johanna Pijmans sequenced cave bear DNA from populations spanning tens of thousands of years and found the population had begun a steep decline starting around 40,000 years ago, well before the coldest, harshest point of the last ice age, and squarely within the window when modern humans were spreading through Europe and increasingly competing for cave space and hunting the bears directly. The timing argued against climate alone driving the decline, since the worst climate conditions came later, after the population had already collapsed. The last confirmed cave bear remains date to around 24,000 years ago. Isotope studies of cave bear bone collagen, including work published by researchers at the Max Planck Institute, show the species was overwhelmingly vegetarian, closer in diet to a modern panda than to a modern brown bear, which makes the case for direct predation on people, or people on bears purely for food, more complicated than a simple contest over meat. What the isotopes support instead is a picture of two species competing over territory rather than over prey, a slow-moving standoff for the driest, warmest chambers of a very small number of usable caves across an entire continent, repeated at cave mouths from Spain to the Caucasus. What is left across Europe are chambers of bone. Drachenholy in Austria, where an estimated 30,000 cave bears worth of remains have been pulled from a single cave system, and Chauvet, where the skulls were arranged with what looks unmistakably like intention. A species that shared shelter with people for tens of thousands of years and lost the argument over who got to keep it. Number 5. Patagonia's dry caves at the southern tip of South America preserved something almost nowhere else on Earth managed to keep: skin. Cueva del Mylodon, a vast limestone cave in southern Chile, first explored in the 1890s by the German settler Hermann Eberhard, produced a sheet of ground sloth hide roughly the size of a small carpet, thick, coarse-haired, and studded with small bony plates called osteoderms embedded directly in the skin, a kind of natural chainmail unique among ground sloths. The animal it belonged to, Mylodon darwinii, stood roughly as tall as an ox and moved on all fours. A slow, heavily built herbivore that had no equivalent left alive anywhere on the planet. The skin's condition was so good that early visitors to the cave debated whether the animal might still be alive somewhere in the unexplored valleys of Patagonia, a rumor energetic enough that an expedition was organized in 1899 specifically to search for a living ground sloth. None was found. What the cave held instead was dung, enormous quantities of it, layered deep enough across the cave floor to be excavated almost like sediment, along with plant remains that let researchers reconstruct the animal's diet in detail. Almost nowhere else in the fossil record allows. Direct evidence for human involvement in Mylodon's end sat for decades on more circumstantial ground. Stone tools found in the same broad region dated close to the same broad window. That changed with more recent, better controlled excavation. A site called Cueva Chica, part of the same cave system, produced ground sloth bone alongside stone tools in a context radiocarbon dated to around 12,600 years ago. Among the latest confirmed dates for Mylodon anywhere, overlapping directly with the earliest well-established human presence in Patagonia. Further north, at the site of Arroyo Seco II in Argentina's Pampas region, excavations led by Gustavo Politis recovered stone tools in direct association with the bones of extinct ground sloths and other megafauna in layers dated to roughly 14,000 years ago, some of the earliest secure evidence of humans hunting megafauna anywhere in South America. A separate line of evidence has emerged from fossilized dung itself, layers of it thick enough at Mylodon-associated caves to be radiocarbon dated in sequence, tracking the animal's diet and local vegetation shift by shift right up until the layers simply stop. At Cueva del Mylodon specifically, the dung sequence shows no sign of a slow dietary decline, no gradual narrowing of available plants consistent with a species running out of food as climate changed around it. The animal was eating well, on a varied diet of grasses and shrubs, until it was not there to eat anything at all, a pattern that has pushed a number of Patagonian researchers, including Fabiana Martin, who has worked extensively on the region's cave sites, toward reading the extinction as sudden rather than gradual. The skin still sits in a case in a museum in Punta Arenas, and a replica hangs in the cave itself, where tourists photograph it against the cave wall, coarse and pale and strange, the closest thing left on Earth to what a ground sloth actually felt like under a human hand. Number 4. Glyptodon looked, to modern eyes, like an armadillo that had swallowed a boulder. It carried a solid domed shell up to 1.5 meters across, made of hundreds of bony plates fused into a single unmoving carapace, a design that had protected its lineage successfully for millions of years against every predator South America had produced. It had no answer, in the end, for a species that could turn the shell itself into a roof. The clearest evidence comes again from Arroyo Seco II, where excavators recovered stone tools embedded directly in Glyptodon bone in a layer dated to roughly 14,000 years ago, cut marks consistent with the animal being butchered where it fell. Elsewhere in Argentina, at a site called Campo Laborde, excavated by a team led by Gustavo Politis and Pablo Messineo, researchers found the remains of a related giant Glyptodon species, Neosclerocalyptus, alongside a dense scatter of stone tools in a layer that showed the animal had been killed, and processed largely in one place, at one time, the kind of concentrated, single-event evidence that is rare and valuable, specifically because it is so hard to argue away as accidental mixing of older bones and younger tools. Perhaps the most striking piece of evidence for how people used Glyptodon after death, rather than only during the kill, comes from a set of trackway and shell use finds published from sites in the Pampas region, where researchers including Alfredo Zurita have documented Glyptodon shells that appear to have been repurposed. In at least one case, a large Glyptodon carapace found in a position and context, suggesting it had been used as a shelter roof by people well after the animal that grew it had died. The shell that had evolved over millions of years to keep predators out ended its useful life, in at least this one case, keeping the weather off the very species that had likely killed the animal that wore it. A single Glyptodon carapace held enough enclosed floor space, by some estimates several square meters under a roof already curved and weatherproof, that turning one into shelter required no more modification than propping it up and crawling underneath, which is very likely why the practice shows up more than once across the Pampas, rather than reading as a single unusual case. The extinction of the Glyptodonts is dated broadly to the same narrow window as the rest of South America's giant mammal die-off, roughly 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, a collapse fast enough and broad enough across so many unrelated species that climate change acting alone has struggled to explain it convincingly to every researcher who has looked at the numbers. What survives is bone, tool, and in a handful of remarkable cases, a fossil shell still bearing the shape of the life that used it twice. Number 3. The American Mastodon, Mammut americanum, was not a mammoth, despite the confusion that still gets made between them. It was a distinct older lineage of proboscidean, built low and heavily muscled with cone-shaped teeth, suited to browsing on twigs and shrubs rather than the flat grinding teeth mammoths carried for grass. And it ranged across most of North America for well over 1 million years before the last individuals died out roughly 10,500 to 11,000 years ago. The single most direct piece of evidence anywhere in the Americas for humans hunting an extinct megafauna comes from a mastodon. In 1977, at the Monus site near Sequim, Washington, the amateur excavator Carl Gustafson found a mastodon rib with a broken piece of bone embedded directly inside it, lodged in a way that could not be explained by chewing, trampling, or natural breakage. The find sat controversial for decades, partly because the dating available at the time was imprecise, and partly because the embedded object was hard to confirm as a worked tool rather than a natural fragment. A team including Michael Waters returned to the specimen with CT scanning and modern radiocarbon methods and published their results in 2011 in the journal Science. The embedded fragment was a fashioned bone projectile point, and the rib dated to roughly 13,800 years ago, making it among the oldest direct evidence of weapon-based hunting of megafauna anywhere in North America, older than the well-known Clovis culture that had long been assumed to represent the continent's first big-game hunters. Elsewhere, the Ocilla River sites in Florida and the Hebior and Schaefer mastodon sites in Wisconsin have produced additional mastodon remains bearing cut marks and found alongside stone tools, building a wider picture across the continent of an animal that appears repeatedly in unrelated locations and unrelated excavations, in direct company with the people who were hunting it. A 2022 genetic and isotopic study led by Emil Karpinski, examining mastodon populations across their range and through time, found signs of shrinking genetic diversity and population fragmentation accelerating in the final millennia before extinction, consistent with the species being squeezed from multiple directions at once as both habitat and hunting pressure closed in during the same narrow window. The mastodon's decline was not uniform across the continent, and that unevenness is itself part of the case against climate acting alone. Populations in the far north, closer to retreating ice sheets and the most dramatic habitat change, in some regional studies persisted about as long as populations much further south, where climate conditions were comparatively stable, but human population density was rising fastest, an inversion of what a purely climate-driven collapse would predict, and closer to what a hunting-driven collapse would look like instead. The Manus rib is held now at the Burke Museum in Seattle, a fragment of bone inside a fragment of bone, evidence that outlasted the argument about whether it was evidence at all. Number 2. New Zealand's moa were flightless, some species standing taller than a person, entirely without natural land predators until people arrived, and they had no reason to be wary of anything walking toward them on two legs. That absence of fear turned out to be fatal on a timescale almost too short for extinction science to be comfortable with. The genetic and archaeological record for moa is unusually precise because New Zealand was one of the last substantial landmasses on Earth to be reached by humans at all, settled by Polynesian voyagers, the ancestors of Maori, likely in the 13th century. A landmark genetic study published in 2014 by a team led by Morton Allentoft, sequencing ancient DNA from dozens of moa specimens across all 9 recognized species, found stable, healthy populations right up until human arrival, with no genetic signature of a long decline beforehand. All 9 species were extinct within roughly a century of people establishing themselves on the islands. One of the fastest documented megafaunal extinctions anywhere in the world, fast enough that Allentoft's team described the moa's disappearance as essentially instantaneous on a geological timescale. The archaeological sites make the mechanism plain rather than inferred. Wairo Bar, on the South Island, excavated across multiple campaigns since the 1940s, and most recently reanalyzed by researchers including Richard Walter, is one of New Zealand's earliest and largest settlement sites, and its refuse layers are dense with moa bone, some individual middens containing the remains of hundreds of birds. The Shag River mouth site on the Otago coast tells a similar story on an even larger scale, a butchery and cooking site where moa were processed by the thousands over a period of likely only a few generations before the birds in that region were simply gone and the site's use shifted to other food sources. Maori oral tradition preserves an awareness of the moa's disappearance that long predates the genetic confirmation, and modern Maori scholarship and iwi-led research have contributed directly to the archaeological record rather than standing outside it, treating the moa's loss as part of a living history rather than only a scientific dataset. Traditions recorded by early ethnographers describe the moa as already scarce and increasingly the subject of story, rather than citing within a few generations of first contact between Polynesian voyagers and the birds. An internal memory of scarcity that lines up closely with what the midden dates now show independently. What is left are middens, thousands of leg bones stacked by people feeding a growing population on the biggest, easiest source of meat the islands had ever offered, until the offering ran out within lifetimes rather than centuries. Number 1, Steller's sea cow is the one animal on this list whose extinction was not reconstructed from bone chemistry, cut marks, or contested cave deposits. It was written down in real time by the person who watched it happen. In 1741, the naturalist Georg Wilhelm Steller was aboard the Russian ship St. Peter, wrecked on an uninhabited island in the Bering Sea during Vitus Bering's expedition to map the North Pacific. Stranded there through a brutal winter, Steller became the only trained scientist ever to observe a living sea cow, a relative of the manatee and dugong, grown enormous in the cold northern water, reaching lengths of up to 9 meters and weighing several tons, entirely herbivorous, feeding on kelp in the shallows, and, Steller recorded, remarkably indifferent to the presence of people. His journals describe an animal that did not flee when approached, that could be waded out to and touched, that showed something close to concern when another of its herd was harpooned nearby, sometimes returning to the water near an injured companion rather than scattering. The stranded crew ate sea cow meat to survive the winter and reported it fed the entire company for extended periods on the strength of a single animal, an efficiency that did not go unnoticed once word of the island and its unappraised, enormous edible mammal reached the Russian fur trade, moving through the North Pacific in the following decades. Hunting ships making the run for sea otter pelts stopped at the Commander Islands to take sea cow meat for provisions, and because the animal was slow, shallow-feeding, unafraid, and calved only once every few years, the population had no capacity to absorb sustained hunting pressure of that kind. Fur trade logbooks from the intervening decades, incomplete as they are, record repeated stops at the Commander Islands specifically to take on sea cow meat, treating the animal less as a curiosity and more as a known, reliable provisioning stop on the route between Kamchatka and the Aleutians, the kind of routine entry in a ship's log that only in hindsight reads as a countdown. The last confirmed Steller's sea cow was killed in 1768, 27 years after Steller's own description was written, a span of time almost absurdly short for a species that had likely ranged across the entire North Pacific Rim within recent geological memory, reduced now to a single tiny surviving population that was found, hunted, and finished within less than 3 decades of being described to science at all. A 2023 genetic study led by researchers including Diana Leduc examined sea cow bone and confirmed a wider historical range around the North Pacific Rim, showing the Bering Sea remnant Steller had encountered was likely already the last fragment of a species in retreat. Its range collapsed well before European ships ever found it, though it was that final fragment's slow, trusting nature that let the record close on it so completely and so fast. Steller's account also recorded something almost none of the other animals on this list left behind at all: behavior. He described the sea cows moving in family groups, keeping the very young toward the center, and he described, more than once, an injured animal's companions staying near it rather than fleeing, a detail that later writers have returned to repeatedly, not because it can be verified by any bone or genome, but because it is the only place on this entire list where the record includes something closer to grief. What survives is Steller's own notebook, a mounted skeleton assembled from scattered bone in museum collections, including the Finnish Museum of Natural History in Helsinki, and a species-length account of an animal that was described, eaten, and erased inside a single working lifetime, the only megafaunal extinction on this entire list that a human being sat down and wrote about while it was still, technically, happening around him. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.